So, chapter 23, Ideologies and Upheavals, and we're picking up today with the Romantic movement. And looking first at the tenets of Romanticism. And so, this Romantic movement was a change in artistic style that was a part of a revolt against this emphasis on rationality and order and restraint that characterized the Enlightenment and classicism. So in previous chapters, we've talked about the age of science and reason and enlightenment and how there's balance and order to everything. And this Romantic movement was really just a revolt against that. And so it was characterized by a belief in emotional exuberance and unrestrained imagination and spontaneity in both art and personal life. And so the Romantics, who were individualist, believed the full development of a person's unique human potential was the supreme purpose in life. So basically, your goal in life for the Romantics was to be your best self. And so they were enchanted by nature, and most of them saw modern industry as an ugly and brutal attack on their beloved nature and on the human personality, because it didn't allow people to reach their full potential. So with Romanticism, the study of history was the key to a universe that was now perceived to be organic and dynamic instead of mechanical and static, as the Enlightenment thinkers had taught. And so this was really played out by one Romantic historian. His name was Jules Michelet, and he focused on the development of societies and human institutions, and alongside that promoted the growth of nationalism. The distinctiveness of Romantic literature really began with two British poets, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And in 1798, they published lyrical ballads. And this was important because it was written in the language of ordinary speech. And they talked about simple subjects as if they were majestic. And so this is really the trend that is set for the Romantic period, is just common, everyday language and ordinary subjects. So between 1820 and 1850, a number of Romantic authors came forth and began writing. And so you have Alexander Dumas, who wrote Count of Monte Cristo, Georges Sand, Victor Hugo, who of course wrote Hunchback of Notre Dame. He really exemplified this romantic fascination with great characters, exotic historical settings, and an emphasis on human emotion. Georges Sand, that was her pen name, but she defied the conventions of her time, one by wearing men's clothing, but also writing about shockingly modern social themes. And so in early and Central Europe, literary Romanticism and early nationalism often reinforced each other. And that was seen especially with Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. And you may have heard of the movie The Grimm Brothers. This is Grimm. But they were German fairy tale writers, and they were successful at rescuing German fairy tales from oblivion by putting them into print. And they were distinctly German, and people identified with them for that reason. And so in Slavic lands, a similar thing happened where Romantic authors advanced the process of converting spoken or oral peasant languages into written languages. And so you really begin to see this trend within Romanticism of, one, simple language, two, human emotion and nature, And 3, combining Romanticism with nationalism. Art and music. So our last category has a lot of names, so I went ahead and put those up there for you so you can see how they're spelled. Probably the greatest French Romantic painter during this time was Eugene Delacroix, and his years of life were 1798 to 1863, and he was just a master of dramatic, colorful scenes that stirred emotions with color. Another notable Romantic English painter was Joseph Turner, and he often depicted the power and the terror of nature. In fact, if you type his name into Google and click on images, there will be endless thumbnail pictures of nature, and many of them are pictures of ships about to be overtaken by the wind and the waves. Or it'll be a sun beaming in over a canyon or something like that. So then you have John Constable, and if you type his name into Google, you also see a lot of like Wordsworthian type landscapes, but you also see humans enjoying those landscapes. And so the Romanticists abandoned well-defined structures. If you look at the art, it's a lot blurrier than what came out of the Renaissance and the age of science and reason and the Enlightenment. The Romantic, the artists and the composers even used a wide variety of forms to create landscapes and music. And basically the goal of both art and music was to evoke a powerful sort of emotion. And so that is reflected in music with Chopin. You see that in his revolutionary etude, and then of course Beethoven on the other extreme, sounding like a funeral march with his Third Symphony. And so between Romantic musicians, you can feel pretty much the depths of human emotion. The most famous Romantic composer was, of course, Beethoven, and he was known for using contrasting themes and tones to try to produce a dramatic conflict and end with inspiring resolutions. And so even though Beethoven began to lose his hearing at the peak of his fame and eventually became totally deaf, he continued to compose immortal music throughout his life. So on a different note, in this slide we're going to be looking at the reforms and revolutions before 1848, and I guess this is sort of the thing that ties us to the last topic, is the time period that we're talking about. And of course, the nationalist movement. And so we'll start with the national liberation movement in Greece. Greece, since the 15th century, had been living under the domination of the Ottoman Turks. But the Greeks had survived as a people who were united by their language and the Greek Orthodox religion. And so this rising sense of nationalism in the 1800s led to the formation of secret societies in Greece, and then eventually to revolt in 1821. And this revolt was led by a guy named Alexander Ypsilanti, maybe. I'll put that up here for you. There's probably no way that you would just come up with this on your own. I know I wouldn't. And he was a Greek patriot and a general in the Russian army. So he very wisely appealed to the great European powers to help him fight off the Turks. But at first, they were still very opposed to revolution and refused to back him up. Yet, many Europeans responded enthusiastically to the Greek national struggle. And as the Greeks continued to fight on against the Turks, they were hoping for the eventual support of European governments. And so in 1827, 6 years after the revolt began, Great Britain, France, and Russia yielded to popular demands at home and directed Turkey to accept a ceasefire. Well, the Turks refused. And so the navies of Great Britain, France, and Russia trapped the Turkish fleet at Navarino, and this is in the Navarino Bay, which is modern-day Pylos, the western side of the Peloponnese Peninsula in the Ionian Sea. And the great powers, of course, destroyed them. And so Great Britain, France, and Russia finally declared Greece independent in 1830. And for safety purposes, they installed a German prince as king of the new country in 1832. Okay, so liberal reform in Great Britain. For the 18th century, British society was really stable, which was not true in many places in Europe in the 18th century. For the most part, there was a general consciousness of people's civil rights, and that was balanced by, of course, the tradition of deference to your social superior. Well, conflicts between the ruling class and the workers were sparked in 1815 when the landed aristocracy selfishly forced changes in the corn laws. And so the basic result from that was that the importation of foreign grain was prohibited unless the price at home rose extremely high. And so what this meant was that poor people could no longer buy cheap imported grain. They had to buy expensive British grain. The revision of the corn laws, which made life even more difficult for the poor people, resulted in protests and demonstrations by urban laborers. And so the government, who was controlled by the Tories or the landed aristocracy, responded by temporarily suspending the right of peaceable assembly and habeas corpus. And so 2 years after that, Parliament then passed the infamous Six Acts, and this placed controls on the press and practically eliminated all mass meetings. And so a change began to occur in the 1820s when a less frightened Tory government moved in the direction of better urban administration, greater economic liberalism, even civil equality for Catholics, and the limited importation of foreign grain. And these actions actually encouraged middle-class people to push even further for that, or push even further than that to reform Parliament so that they could have a larger say in government. And so the Whig Party had by tradition been more responsive to middle-class commercial and manufacturing interests, and so they sponsored the Reform Bill of 1832. The Reform Bill really just changed the system of election. It was basically electoral reform, which made voting more democratic. But this surge of popular support that pushed this bill into law also moved politics in a more democratic direction in general, which allowed the House of Commons to become the all-important the all-important legislative body. So the new industrial areas of the country actually gained representation in the House of Commons. So the number of voters increased by about 50%, which was still only 12% of adult men. But a major reform had been achieved peacefully, so that was good. And so this was carried even further by the Chartist movement, and basically their aim was to achieve universal manhood suffrage or universal male suffrage, the right of all men to vote regardless of property qualifications or social status. And so in addition to calling for that, many working class people joined with middle class manufacturers in the Anti-Corn Law League, which was founded in Manchester in 1839. So luckily for them, the Corn Law was actually repealed in 1846 when a group of Tories, just a few Tories, joined the Whigs to repeal that law after the Irish potato crop failed in 1845, and famine prices for food seemed likely in England as well. So they repealed the law and allowed the free import of grain again. And so from that point on, the liberal doctrine of free trade became almost like a sacred dogma in Britain. And the Tories even passed the 10 Hours Act of 1847, which limited the workday for young people and women to 10 hours in factories. Ireland and the Great Famine. So most of the people of Ireland, who were almost entirely Irish Catholics, didn't really benefit from the reform movement in Britain, but they continued to remain under the oppression of a minority of the Church of England Protestant landlords, pretty much. And so conditions were abominable, and despite that, though the population did grow a little bit, from 1725 to 1840, it grew from 3 million to 8 million. And really that was attributed to the cultivation of the potato. And Irish families, they married, they had large families, and that made sense for peasants. Rural poverty was inescapable, so it was better to share that with a spouse. And if you have a dutiful son or a loving daughter, then when you're old, maybe they can take care of you or provide for you. And so as the population grew, so did the dependency on the potato crop, and that made conditions even more precarious. And so when there were potato crop failures in 1845, 46, 48, and 51, it resulted in the Great Famine. And this was just a period of widespread starvation and massive fever epidemics. And so the British government was slow to act, and when it did, its relief efforts were really inadequate. And on top of that, the British government continued to collect taxes. Landlords still demanded their rents, and tenants who could not pay were evicted from their homes. And so the Great Famine really shattered the pattern of population growth in Ireland. About 1 million people fled the famine between 1845 and 1851. About 1.5 million died, or they were unborn because of the disaster. And the Great Famine, on top of that, just intensified anti-British feeling and promoted Irish nationalism, eventually leading to campaigns for Irish independence. And we'll actually stop there and pick up with the Revolution of 1830 in France tomorrow.